everybody, it's me, Ian. This here is a video about the logistics of running a crowdfunding campaign, and about the advantages and disadvantages of Kickstarter as opposed to Patreon, and Patreon as opposed to Kickstarter. This is one of two simultaneously released videos on my channel right now about crowdfunding. This one is called Getting Your Ass Paid. The other one is less pragmatic and is more about understanding how and why crowdfunding works for people, which I think is critical for engaging with your audience. That one's called Getting My Ass Paid because it doubles as my Patreon announcement. If you want me to keep making videos about this stuff, or about anything really, or if you want to make your own stuff and get paid for it, it's worth checking out. Not everybody knows this, but among other gigs, I used to freelance as a crowdfunding consultant, mostly for Boston area indie game developers. I've worked very closely with a couple campaigns and given some degree of feedback to several others. Some of what I know comes from crunching numbers on those campaigns, but a lot of it is just years of aggregating free articles and data on the internet. What always surprised me when I'd meet with people is how much people who want to run crowdfunding campaigns don't know about crowdfunding. I suppose that makes sense, as indie developers probably don't have as much time to read shit on the internet about crowdfunding as crowdfunding consultants do. But since running my own Kickstarter in 2014 and spending most of 2015 treating this YouTube channel as a proper job, I haven't had time to consult with people. So a lot of this is just what I would make sure people know after one consultation with me. I'm putting this online in case you ever want to run a campaign of your own. It cost me nothing to get it, now I'm giving it to you. Starting at the top. Do you go to the website KickTrack? Because if you're thinking of running a campaign, you definitely should. They scrape data for every campaign on Kickstarter, and among other useful things, color code them. Red for under 25%, orange for above 25 but under 100, and green for funded or overfunded. And if you look at the projects ending today section, you'll notice something. It's almost all red and green. And most projects in the red aren't as close to 25% as they are to, like, 0%. In short, generally speaking, projects on Kickstarter are either successful or they never had a chance. On Kickstarter, projects that get halfway to their funding goal only go on to fail 18% of the time. Once you get 3/4 of the way, it's like 2%, but let's focus on that 18. Ideas that were clearly good enough to get some traction, but still weren't successful. Why not? If you have an idea that no one really wants and you want to convince them that they do, I got nothing for you. The reality is sometimes the market just doesn't want what you're selling. But looking at that 18%, I found that the failure of a project that should have been successful usually came down to one of three things. Number one, people didn't see it. Most people don't browse Kickstarter and Patreon just looking for ways to spend money. They find your campaign because they are directed to it. And that means you gotta be out there directing them. It's surprising how many people think the internet will just find them. You have to be on social media and you have to know how to use social media, or at least get a teammate who does. And cultivating an audience takes time, which means if you're thinking of ever running a campaign, you should be on Twitter, Tumblr, and Facebook, like now, and probably YouTube. Also, if there's any press that covers the kind of campaign that you're running, you need to know about it. You need to contact journalists. That means you need to know how to pitch an article and who to pitch it to. More info about that in the down there part, but as a general rule, never, ever, ever, ever start a press email with, "I've just launched a Kickstarter." Everybody hates that email. Number two, people saw it, but they didn't get it. You need to know how to talk about your project. If your video starts too slowly, people are going to turn it off before you get to the point. And if too much explaining happens in the text of the page and not in the video itself, many people won't see it. Remember, when your fans link to your campaign on social media, it often only embeds the video. If you left something critical in the text, it might as well not be there. But mostly, you need to know what makes your project interesting to someone who's only going to spare you a couple of minutes. You've got to say who you are and why what you're doing is interesting in a handful of sentences. Maybe try describing your project in detail to a couple of friends and then asking them to repeat it back to you in like under a minute. The parts that they remember are maybe your biggest selling points. Number three, people saw it, they understood it, but they didn't think you could pull it off. This is often a scope problem. It seems like you're promising more than you could possibly deliver on your chosen budget. Though sometimes it's the inverse. You seem to be asking for more than the project appears to need. Now, that perception often comes from backers in reality having no idea how much it costs to make shit. And the only way to combat it is to make sure you're being appropriately modest in your budget, but also just be super transparent about where the money's going. You also need to show your skills, which for one means the format formatting of your page and the production values of your video don't need to be impeccable, but they can't be inept. Be sure to show projects you finished in the past. Even better, projects in the medium that you're pitching in. And even better, work that's already been done on the project itself. The more the project already exists, the safer people feel throwing money at it. Though it still does need to be clear that the project cannot be finished without money. And that segues nicely into one of the major hang-ups about being an independent person on the web. There are ways to dodge this, like freelancing or working day jobs in your own field if those exist in your field. But by and large, if you want to monetize your own stuff on the web, first you get to do it for free. There's a lot of free stuff on the internet, and if you want people to pay out money for your stuff instead of looking at that other stuff, they gotta know that they already like it. And that's crap. Unpaid labor is, in a word, bullshit. And it's a problem with the modern economy in general. The fact that it's hard to get a job unless your resume says you've worked an unpaid internship is also crap. But it's what we're stuck with right now. A few campaigns will sell on the strength of a good idea alone. But most of us have to keep ourselves fed and clothed and treat our projects as hobbies until they are far enough along to be crowdfunded. It's not fair, but it is sometimes preferable to selling your idea to some company. Alright, so brass tacks. Let's talk about Kickstarter. There are a lot of advantages to using Kickstarter. Kickstarter is like looking for investors, where Patreon is more like looking for subscribers. One is a big lump of money, and the other is continued support. When I launched my campaign for an ongoing video series, a lot of people asked why I didn't just go straight to Patreon, because that seemed like a better fit. And there were a few reasons for that, but a big one is just that of all the crowdfunding platforms, Kickstarter is the biggest. It's huge. A lot of the people who might back your project probably already have accounts. And if you're worried about whether or not you're going to get enough of the money that you need for your project, the safest bet is the site with the biggest user base. Another advantage is that with Kickstarter, you run the campaign, you get the money, and then you make the project. With Patreon, you run the campaign, you make an installment of the project, and at the end of the month, you get paid. So if you need money before you can start work on a project, like you need resources or you can't afford to quit a job until you know there's money waiting for you, Kickstarter makes the most sense. Another thing, and this is just a gut feeling, but people seem more comfortable making one-time payments than ongoing ones, even if the one-time payment is bigger than like an entire year as a patron. I launched my campaign on the strength of one video essay because between school and jobs, I hadn't had time to make more. And that's an awkward position for any crowdfunding campaign. But it seemed to me that if you liked this essay, give me some money and I'll make more, was an easier sell than if you liked this essay, give me money forever. As for the disadvantages of Kickstarter, well, there are the basics. Some countries still aren't supported, and if you fall at all short of your goal, you get nothing. People are talking about Kickstarter fatigue, that the world is getting sick of Kickstarters, but I'm not super worried about that. It may be true that people aren't excited about the revolution in commerce anymore, but I don't think Kickstarter's model is going anywhere. People are maybe getting choosier about how they spend their money there, but if people see something they like on Kickstarter, they're not gonna refuse it on principle. Kickstarter is just becoming a way to buy and sell things, nothing more, nothing less. One thing I have noticed is that when I first started paying attention to Kickstarter, the success rate was a little bit better than 50-50. All things being equal, the odds were slightly in your favor. In every year since, the amount of money spent on Kickstarter has gone up, while that success rate has incrementally gone down year by year. There are a couple of likely explanations for this. One is that the number of projects getting launched, or at least the amount of total money being asked for, is expanding faster than the amount of money actually being spent. The other is that the money being spent is like clumping into smaller numbers of big blockbuster projects. In reality, it's probably a mix of both. But regardless, you do have to shout a little bit louder to be heard. And the truth is, it's probably only going to get harder with time. Now let's talk about Patreon. The disadvantages of Patreon are, for starters, the inverse of Kickstarter's advantages. It's smaller, it pays out later, and ongoing payments feel like a bigger ask. A lot of people don't already have Patreon accounts, which means they will have to make one. And if there is any barrier between people wanting to give you money and actually giving it to you, you're gonna lose some people. And given the smaller size, Patreon campaigns don't go viral the way Kickstarter campaigns sometimes do. People can see a Kickstarter campaign from someone they've never heard of and go, yeah, I'll back that. On Patreon, that doesn't happen very much. While this is true of all crowdfunding sites, Patreon, more than any of them, is a platform for monetizing an audience you already have. So if you don't already have an audience, you might need to ask, even if Patreon is the best model for what you're doing, is now the right time to launch one? Also, because Patreon is a process where Kickstarter is like an event with this built-in all-or-nothing hook and a deadline, journalists are a lot less likely to write about your Patreon. It just doesn't drive traffic in the same way. And do keep in mind, Patreon is sustaining a lot of cool people, but as of now, Patreon does not make anybody rich. One advantage of Patreon is that since nobody gets rich there, there's not a lot of that corporate interest that's starting to seep into Kickstarter. You can think of Patreon as kind of being like Sundance in the early 90s, where Kickstarter is more like Sundance today, where there's still a lot of low-budget indie stuff, but also a lot of big-name, big-budget projects. And those projects are operating on a very different economic mindset. That's much less of a thing on Patreon. It still kind of runs like it's supposed to run. Also, obviously, it's ongoing. You get paid every month. And for what I'm doing, it can actually pay a lot better than YouTube. 50,000 people will get you a few $100 through YouTube ads. 500 people can get you a few thousand through Patreon. Like, that's a thing that happens. What we're getting at here is not that either platform is empirically better than the other, but rather, given your project and your circumstances, which platform is better for you? I did Kickstarter, and I'm confident that that was the best move for me. Now I'm on Patreon, and it's up to my audience whether or not that shoe fits. I encourage you to watch that other video because the why of crowdfunding is at least as important as the how. If you want to hear more from me about this or any other topic, that Patreon is the best way to make sure that happens. And regardless, best of luck with your own projects, and thank you for watching.